Well, it's my joy and privilege to be joined by John Anderson. John Anderson is a sixth-generation farmer from New South Wales who served our country in the Australian Parliament for almost 20 years. And during that time, he served as the Deputy Prime Minister and the leader of the National Party of Australia. He was well known in Parliament and indeed in the public square for his integrity, his commitment to truth, and indeed his Christian faith. Today, John and his wife live on their farm in New South Wales. They have 5 children, and John continues to be an active voice in the public square as a writer, a speaker, and a host of a series of brilliant interviews which you can catch online. John Anderson, welcome.
Good to be with you. It's a great honour, Guy.
Wonderful to be with you. I want to begin on the 11th of September 2001. I receive a call from a friend of mine telling me that the World Trade Center is under attack and to put on my TV. And so racing downstairs, like most Australians, I stood in shock and disbelief when I saw those airline carriers charging into those World Trade Centers, and the sense of disbelief, the sense of fear and chaos that hit the world in that very moment. At that moment, John, you were serving as the acting Prime Minister of Australia. I'm keen for you to take us to that moment. How did you find out? How did you feel? And what were your first responses?
It was a tumultuous week. The Prime Minister was in Washington. He was only a mile away from where one of the planes ploughed into the Pentagon. And it was also the week when Ansett failed and there was a refugee crisis going on. And I'd worked right through the Sunday night and the Monday night trying to find a way to keep Ansett flying and get people home and arrange for an orderly sale rather than a bankruptcy. And had fallen into bed totally and utterly exhausted because I'd had only hours sleep for the past 2 or 3 days.
Wow.
And I was in a strange motel. My phone started to go only an hour or so after I'd nodded off, probably less. My press secretary screaming down the phone, "Get your television on, get your television on." You wouldn't believe it, as fate would have it, the batteries in the remote were flat. So I had to try and work out in a fogged and totally exhausted stage how to turn the thing on manually, which you could do just in time to see, I think, the second plane ploughing into a building. And like everybody else, I really wondered just what this was. Was it real? Was this some spoof? It was pretty obvious pretty quickly that it wasn't. It was very serious. And now's a good time to be thinking about it, actually. You know, you record the events as best you can and understand them at the time. Historians will say around 20 years on, which it is now, is a good time to look back and understand its significance. In 100 years' time, we'll really understand what it all meant. But it was serious. It was very serious. And it is ricocheting down to us right now as we speak in terms of what's happening around the world.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about how that moment, changed the world from your perspective?
Very important to remember that in 2001, it was only 10, 11, 12 years since the Berlin Wall had come down. That was significant because there was an assumption in the Western democracies that totalitarianism was on the wane. The famous and very gifted American writer, Francis Fukuyama, of Japanese background, wrote a book called The End of History. It's a play on something Marx said, as I understand it. He talked about the end of history being a utopian Marxist state, classless, atheist, and what have you. We know how that turned out. Fukuyama was making the point that the real outcome of the end of history was that the democracies won out, freedom won out, capitalism won out. And then there was the rude awakening when we realised that there were people who loathed the West, who thought it was degenerate, who loathed and hated its people so much that they were prepared to die, taking out very large numbers of other people's lives. It was a very, very significant political moment in the history of humanity, in my view. I think we can see that now 20 years on. I think we'll see it more clearly as the coming decades unfold. There's nothing secure about this, what some writers have called this garden in the jungle that we live in, called free, democratic, participatory democracy. We love to mock it. That's part of our problem. We don't seem to believe in it anymore. But I have noticed when you ask people, can they think of a regime that they'd rather live in, they can't usually name one.
Well, I appreciate those words, John. It was clearly an event that changed our world, and it almost seems like we're living in another one of those moments right now. When I saw the World Trade Center go down, you'd think, gee, nothing like this had ever happened in our world. It feels like right now with COVID-19 and the impact across the world, it's so unexpected in some sense, at least to me, and yet here we are. As someone who served at really the highest office in Australia in the political space, could you give us an insight as to what would be happening behind the scenes in that sphere right now as they seek to make sense of this and to find a way out?
Well, as you know, the nation's leaders, political, medical, scientific, bureaucratic, welfare and so forth, are meeting almost constantly as a situation unfolds. Vast amounts of money are being committed to try and help people through the economic crisis that has in fact been created by governments deliberately in a premeditated and determined and intentional way, closing our economy down. I mean, that is almost unprecedented in an attempt to beat COVID-19. So the pressures are enormous. I worry deeply that in many ways we cut our leaders so little slack and have so little understanding, and we're so reluctant now to trust them that it's enormously discouraging for them. And I think one of the problems is that experience is washed out of our parliaments. People are exhausted by it. They're sick of it. They don't feel respected and appreciated. Many of them leave before they've given everything that they could. And the other side of that coin is that we're not attracting the people of calibre and character in numbers. I don't want to sound critical of those who are serving, but I think we could do many of our best and brightest, but let me put it that way, simply say, I don't want to be involved in leadership because it's such a thankless task. That, I think, is a great change. People used to say to me, it's thankless. I think by today's standards, people were incredibly generous to me. I can't tell you some of the appreciative letters and comments and emails and things I've had since the event we've just been talking about, 9/11. We were thankful you were there, what have you. Not sure I was thankful that I was there, but I did my level best. I sometimes tell the story about getting down literally more than hands and knees on the floor and pleading with God, saying, Lord, please give me what I need to see my way through this, to honour you and the people I must now serve as the leader. What happens to me is irrelevant if I'm lost or sacrificed in the middle of this mess, so long as I've done everything I can under you and under, if you like, the Australian people. That's all that matters. It was a cathartic moment for me, I can assure you. Some people, I suppose, might say, well, it must be tempting to jump off the bridge. It never, the bridge of the ship as it goes down, or as you fear it may go down. That was never an option. I must say I knew a great sense of peace, having thus appealed to the Almighty.
That image of you, praying to the Lord amidst some very challenging seasons and moments for our country is a very telling image. Could you tell me a little bit, how did, I suppose, your faith as a Christian, how was it lived out? What were those moments like? How did you walk with the Lord? Times you doubted God, perhaps, times you went to him with great urgency. Could you give us a bit of an insight into what that journey was like from that spiritual point of view?
Well, there are two comments. One is that, there's a lot of truth, I think, in the old saying that there are no atheists in the trenches. When the chips are really down and you are genuinely fearful for what might be coming or what is happening and what might be coming, you tend to drop any pretenses. And most of us, we know this from the data. I know that every time we do a census, we've just done one, In the media, there's a whole lot of salivating that more people might say that they have no faith. But perhaps in some ways that reflects a time. This is a really interesting point when we've assumed we can do away with suffering, that government can play God, that it'll look after us from cradle to grave, and we don't need God. Maybe we're doing a rethink at the moment. We're not in control of our destiny. It's one of the great things humanity should never forget. You are not in control of your destiny, and I'm not in control of mine. We can make certain options. We can prepare ourselves for the road, but we cannot make the road work for us. We can't. Look, the other point that I'd make, I think, is this one. I've never faced bullets. I have faced a couple of emergencies, and I suppose that was arguably one of them. But there's a sense in which your head clears and you become aware that you have to do what you have to do because you have to do it. It's there before you and you must do it. So to the best of your ability, you do it.
And you did it so well, John. John Howard said, "I've not met a person with greater integrity in public life." That's quite an accolade, quite a statement, and a testimony to God's grace and goodness in your life. I'm keen to know, because I'm keen to know, why integrity and that fibre in you was important, number one. But how did you pursue that? How did you seek to cultivate that in your public life?
I don't know that I have a glib answer to that. It's partly that I grew up in a family that still had a carryover. We were not churchgoers. My father was not a churchgoer at all. But there was a carryover of a fairly stern Presbyterianism. Dad liked to party, I have to say, but he thought integrity mattered hugely. He would cross the T's and dot the I's when he did his tax reform. I remember as a little boy being struck by the fact that someone turned up and wanted payment for delivering some fence posts on a Sunday. And my father said, "I'm reluctant to write you a cheque on Sunday. It doesn't seem right." And I thought, that's a very remarkable thing for a man who doesn't go to church. But he still had that respect for Christianity. And, we know that our God detests a lack of integrity, because when we're not honest, we're always in some way cheating someone else. And I think I've always been aware that whether it's cheating on your taxes, whether it's lying about something that some other kid's done or whatever in the classroom or whatever, someone always loses once you stop telling the truth. But the interesting thing is that it was incredibly kind of John Howard to say that. And I said to him, because I count him a good friend and we often catch up. I said to him one day, "You made a rod for my back in a way, John, by saying that, because I live in fear now that whether rightly or wrongly, someone one day will attach something to me that undermines that, and I will, I'll be seen as some sort of second-rate crook." And like all Christians, I'm conscious that I could slip up. I'm sure I haven't always done the right thing. The other thing, though, that John said about me in his book that in a way meant more, he wrote a book about Lazarus Rising, he called it, and it has a photograph of the two of us out in a paddock somewhere. And he referred to me as his longest-serving deputy and said, "We trusted each other completely." And, trust is something we don't talk about enough. Again, I'm fascinated by data. I'm very interested in the research. And we are more distrustful than ever. It's astonishing how reluctant we are to trust now. And yet every human relationship at every level depends absolutely on trust. To the extent that trust is there, human flourishing and cooperation and even love can flow. To the extent that it's not, the capacity to work together and flourish together is minimised. So it's a very important aspect of our personal lives, but also our public lives. And it's one of the indicators of the deep trouble we are in as a culture. I'm sorry, there's no point in me gilding the lily. I have to say to you, I believe our culture is in deep trouble. And one of the most potent reflectors and drivers of that is this complete, extraordinary level of breakdown of trust in our institutions, in our leaders, in our churches, I have to be honest. It's extraordinary and it's very worrying.
Mm. Do you want to unpack that a bit more for me, John?
Well, think of the banking, the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the banking and financial services. The idea that you can't trust a banker with your dollar is pretty horrendous.
Mm.
And so we say, oh, it's great. We had a Royal Commission of Inquiry. We found out that they were robbing us. No, there are a lot of bankers who weren't. Let me say that. But the problem is that there were too many who were.
Mm.
And if you take one example, the AMP, the Australian Mutual Provident Society, was set up by a bunch of Christians, some of them businessmen, some of them clergy. Its official historian, Geoffrey Blaney, wrote that it became the most trusted institution in Australia after the churches. So there was a time when the churches were deeply trusted and the AMP was deeply trusted. There weren't many prudential arrangements. They weren't surrounded by laws and regulations and, parliamentary inquiries and what have you. They behaved honourably because they were honourable. And in fact, the whole idea was to ensure that people could provide for their retirement and for their widows if they lost their jobs or were killed at work. It was all noble. And the AMP became almost a byword for trust. You can bank on the AMP. They'll look after you. They'll do the right thing. Their reputation was smashed.
Wow.
Because it was evident they'd been charging for people's services not provided, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, anybody with any real sensitivity and honesty, if they look closely at it, will realise that it blew apart a lot of modern mythology. But here's the rub. The result of the inquiry was something like 70 new regulations, 70 new laws, with all of the policing and all of the sanctions and all of the machinery that goes with 70 new laws. The result, less economic freedom. When trust breaks down, freedom breaks down. When you don't trust your neighbour, you won't be frank and open with them, and they won't be frank and open with you. When you don't trust your wife or your wife can't trust you, your marriage is in trouble. When you don't trust your politicians, not only will the relationship between elected and elector break down, you exacerbate the problem because the good people that are there don't feel that they're being recognised for trying to be honest, and good people who might want to serve say, well, I can be the most honest bloke in town and they'll still think I'm a crook. I don't want to go there. And if they don't say it, their wives and kids will say it. I had a star recruit, a man of some faith, I must say, an outstanding young Australian who wanted to run for office. He was very well known at the time, very highly regarded. I won't say any more. Very highly regarded, almost a household name. He was a brilliant sportsman. And he wanted to have a go. And his father said to him, don't, you're revered, you're trusted. If you go into that game, you'll neither be revered or trusted anymore.
Wow.
So who loses? We lost the services of a man who might have ended up as Prime Minister.
Well, that's quite remarkable. It occurs to me, following on from what you've said, the establishing of trust, the speaking of truth, honesty and authenticity, these are big, big cultural values and needs that we all have. And particularly in the political space, I think, more and more we need leaders who can enter into life, who recognise the everyday challenges that we experience, who feel among us. And John, even, as I've got to know you and learn more about your story, I've not only have you soared great heights in terms of your political and public profession, but you've also known some of the difficulties of life, the tragedies of life, and indeed the sufferings of life at a very young age. I was listening to an interview with you where you were sharing about the death of your sister, and it was hard to hear and sad, and yet you've obviously reflected deeply on that. And so I'm hopeful that perhaps you could share a little bit about that, and what had taken place and how you've since reflected on that.
Well, we'll chalk this one up to Jordan Peterson. It's a story that I was reluctant to talk about. The media didn't know about it until I'd been in Parliament for 10 years, and then someone blew the story, but it was all over the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. When I was a teenager, my father was a very keen sportsman. So every afternoon when we were at home, it would be shooting practice, it would be boxing practice or cricket. and we were having a backyard, except it was the front yard, game of cricket at home when I was a young teenager. And I found the sweet spot and was belting my father all over the place. He was bowling, and I was feeling good, and I could see the pride in his face as he thought the kid's finally getting it. And extraordinarily, freakishly, my younger sister, who was watching us from the sideline, looked up to see one of my balls coming straight for her. She turned away, caught her in the back of the neck and killed her instantly. Now, that was a shocking thing to happen, and I agreed to talk to SBS on it. I'm going to say this, as is so often the case with the modern media, though, I wanted to say to young people, look, tough and terrible things happen, but there is a way through. And in my case, having gone to a place where very few people go to, it's an enormous sense of loneliness. You don't feel anybody understands, because I have met other people that have been in this experience, inadvertently and accidentally killed somebody else. And it's a terrible place to go to, one of great loneliness, one where if you're young, your childhood ends instantly. My childhood ended that afternoon. I was never a child again. I might have acted childishly, but any sense of carefree, childish joy had gone. And I did explain, though, on SBS, and most of it was excised out. And it's made me very, very wary of that organisation and its sister organisation. They're very good at telling you what's wrong with the world. They don't like anybody presenting solutions unless it involves government money. It seems to me to be really cynical. I know that sounds tough, but I think they need to have a long, hard look at themselves, those organisations. And what I explained was, and I put a lot of thought into it, that if you like, what I was presented with was this three-sided triangle. The first is, why suffering? Second is, does anybody understand? Does anybody care? The third is, will the pain end? Now, they're big questions that arise out of something like that. And I explained to the best of my ability that I came to the conclusion that the Christian worldview was the right one. Suffering is not good. It was not intended that we suffer, but we brought it on ourselves when we broke the world by behaving selfishly. That's one side of the triangle. It's not a complete answer. Why me? Why my sister? Why not the other way around? But it is at least some sort of umbrella understanding as to why there is suffering, and there is massive suffering in the world. Secondly, does anybody understand? Well, here's the extraordinary thing. Yes, God humbled himself to a crucifixion, the most unjust trial ever perpetrated, even by the standards of the lawyers and the legal processes of the day. The trial of Christ was a farce. At 6 or 7 points, I'm told by lawyers who know their stuff, the law was perverted. And here we have a story so powerful of the King of the universe humbling himself to be put through utter travesties by the beings he'd created, and yet goes like a lamb to the slaughter. He dies and he's resurrected. So yes, he knows the suffering, but what's more than that, he cares. He cares enough for me to be able to say, Lord, if I place my trust in you, will you give me life? And then the third side of the triangle is directly related to that. Is there hope? Will the wounds be bound up? Will the pain come to an end? And again, we have the assurance that none of this was meant to be. We brought it on ourselves. But if we will but trust in Christ, yes, the suffering will come to an end. Yes, there will be joy. In my Father's house, there are many rooms. I came to believe that. I have always believed it, although I have wandered many times. And I've often, I think, nailed Christ to the cross again in my heart and in my actions. And I'm ashamed of that. But at heart, I have never been able to or wanted to be without that secure hope, that faith. Yes, there is an explanation for suffering, though we can't understand it completely. Yes, someone understands and cares enough, the God of the universe himself, to offer a way out. Yes, the pain will come to an end.
Thank you, John, for sharing that and that piece of your own story. And I find great encouragement, and I think a lot of people, even myself, resonate with that sense of, growing up in a broken and fractured world. No one makes it through this world unscathed, and to hear you share that and to see how that prompted big questions, and those questions found not just their answers, but hope in Christ is profound and significant. As I've served as a pastor myself, and listened to a lot of your interviews and read a lot of your writing, it's clear that here is this great message of hope that has changed lives, your life, my life, and so many, and been such a blessing and a culture-forming influence, particularly in the West. And yet today, it's no longer convenient to be a Christian, or it's no longer revered or even celebrated in the public square. It's very much condemned and on the margins. How have you over the years seen perhaps a shifting trend where the gospel, this great message of hope, has more and more been sidelined, and people who want to hold that have been pushed to the edges?
Well, to go back to my analogy of the garden in a jungle, it was carved out by people who had a high view of the individual. Mm. And Greg Sheridan's just written a wonderful book, just simply called Christians: The Urgent Case for Jesus in Our Modern World. Now, he's one of the country's leading journalists. No one's more influential in foreign affairs or better understands foreign affairs than Greg Sheridan. And he makes the really interesting and telling point that the Apostle Paul in particular, in all of his teachings, changes the way we think. When we understand the God he's writing about and when we understand ourselves, we understand something deeply profound. Interestingly enough, Menzies, our Prime Minister Menzies, our longest serving, understood this and wrote about it. He came from Melbourne, and he's a very thoughtful, very highly educated person who grew up in the little Victorian town of Chaparral. Paul wrote that we're no longer, consider ourselves, we're no longer man and woman, black and white, man and woman, slave nor free, Jew nor Gentile, but all one in Christ. That's universalism. All souls equal in the eyes of heaven. We have rejected that in exactly the same way as Adam and Eve did in the garden. We said, no, we know better. We don't want God in control of our lives. We will run our lives. Now, we have that choice. I mean, I think what effectively God's answer is, well, I'm heartbroken that you've chosen to do that, but I have given you free will, so I'll let you do it. I do warn you, I don't think it's going to work out very well, and it's not working out very well. We need to realize that the great progressive, that's called progressive experience, it's regressive. We're just going back to our natural state. Identity politics, where we all brawl with everybody else except our little club, which is morally superior, and we think that in our ignorance. Rather than respecting each individual and recognizing that all of us are a mixture of good and bad. We're all dual personalities. But the big question, the big challenge for modern progressives is, how's it working out, chaps? We've got record levels of anxiety, of depression, of self-harm. We're tribalised, we're divided, we loathe our culture. We don't believe that anybody who's gone before us, including Christ, can tell us anything of any value. Now, of course, you see, the great majority of people in the middle know that the people who are shouting so loudly, the people who have the cultural heft, we're good Christians, so we shouldn't say it. I'll find an 8-letter word that means nonsense that's not too offensive. It's bulldust. We know it's bulldust. And if you doubt that, look at the people who turn out to hear Jordan Peterson, who delivers raw, gritty home truths to millennials. They book his talks out. They read his books in record numbers. The left-wing New York Times acknowledges that he is the world's leading public intellectual at the moment. I count him a friend. I find him an unbelievably sincere and thoughtful and considerate and other person-centered man. I don't agree with absolutely everything, although I'm struggling to think of much that I do disagree with him on. But I think he's done a tremendous service, and he's blown a hole so big that a truck could drive through it in a lot of modern, what passes for intellectual and moral rigor. Blown a hole in it. And people know that. So I particularly believe that every time I say this, I'll get letters and things saying, oh, no, you've got it wrong. Our youth are just completely misguided. I don't believe that. Many of them are. Many of them are lost souls. We've sold them a pup and they bought it. That's an old expression, we sold them a dud and they bought it. But there are many, many, many fine young people who are looking for answers as well. They know that, an empathy culture, a victim culture where everybody's either a victim or an oppressor, a victim maker, is a very unsatisfactory and horrible place to live in.
Yeah, and it certainly seems that way, that it is growing a victim culture. I certainly see it and feel it. Where does that come from? Where do you think it's come from? Is it a new thing? Is this something we can see throughout history? And how is it impacting our culture?
There are victims. There's no two ways about that. And we should always be sympathetic for them. The real victims, Christ showed great compassion for. The Bible is constantly reminding us that justice matters, and looking after the weak and the oppressed and the marginalised and the poor and the widowed and the fatherless is unbelievably important. And I don't want to say there aren't victims, but we've now reached the point where if you want affirmation, this is showing up in the extraordinary explosion of middle and upper class white girls who have gender dysphoria. It's a way to paint yourself as being a victim and in need of affirmation. And of course, you're massively affirmed. And I realise that I don't want to sound harsh for those who are struggling genuinely with these issues, but we know that what happens now is that you get involved in a chat group online with other people who are feeling like you, victimised on the outside, and it's a wonderful way to get affirmation in an age when many of our young people are very, very lonely. So in one of the conversations I had with a man who's not a man of faith, but I have an incredible regard for him, Peter Baldwin. He was a minister back in the Hawke government, very intellectually gifted and wonderfully honest man. He says, we're creating a new aristocracy now out of victims, whereas once the Labor movement believed in universalism, everyone was of at least equal value in a spiritual sense, if I can put it that way, and that the Labor Party's job was to ensure that everybody was included in Family Australia, and they wanted to level things out, I suppose, pull the tall poppies down and lift up the weak and the oppressed. There's a certain nobility in that. You can see the Christian overtones in much of the early Labor movement. Here's a stunning statistic for you. The first time the Labor Party organised itself in Australia was to run candidates. And I think about the 1891 election in the state of New South Wales, and 35 Labor MPs were elected, and 21 of them were evangelical believers from typically Methodist and Presbyterian backgrounds and so forth. They had a social conscience. They believed in universalism. Why have we moved away from it? I think we've just reverted to type. The jungle's re-encroaching. We're just going back to our natural state where we're suspicious of everybody and where we tribalise for protection. We try to look after one another in the tribe. There's a little bit of nobility in that. Unfortunately, not very much in a peaceful society like ours, where we ought to be able to cooperate even with people that we disagree with. But then we turn around and say, well, you're not even virtuous because you don't believe as I believe on this issue or that issue. So I don't say Guy is a virtuous man because he's prudent and he's courageous and he cares about justice and he's temperate and he's moderate and he displays faith, hope and love, the Christian virtues, the first four of the sort of classic Greek and Roman virtues, I suppose you'd say, the others the Christian. I don't say that you're virtuous because you display those qualities. I say, no, you're virtuous because you're on the right side of this culture war or that culture war or whatever. Or I might say, no, you believe in Christianity. You couldn't possibly be a virtuous person. I mean, it's a load of nonsense. We're not thinking clearly. As Thomas Sowell says, years of dumbed-down education have produced people who confuse feeling with thinking. They think feeling is thinking. And it's a massive problem for us. We've got to learn to think clearly and analytically and make sure that we're lining up our feelings with reality if we're to ensure the survival of the wonderful freedoms that we take for granted and which we will truly lament if we once lose them.
Mm. And as you think about those divides, John, and as we, particularly in Christians, lots of different people who might associate on the left or might associate on the right, or believe this and believe that about different political issues. How do we bridge those gaps, or even how do we love people well that we disagree with? How do we do that well? You would have no doubt engaged with lots of different people throughout your public and political life, people you agreed with, people you disagreed with. How do we engage the real issues in a serious and intentional way, but as Christians? What does that look like to engage in the public square like that?
Well, we have the ultimate example, don't we, in Christ himself. People that he loved, put him through a sham of a trial and hung him on a cross and allowed him to suffer the ignominy of excruciating pain and spiritual loneliness beyond our imagination. Separation from our loved one hurts us, but if God is us magnified many millions of times, the agony for Christ in being separated from his Father, my God, why have you forsaken me, must have been beyond anything we could imagine. But what does he do? Forgive them, Lord, for they know not what they do. He says to one of the robbers, who shows some contrition beside him, today you'll be with me in paradise. We have his example of turning the other cheek when he's been slapped. Very hard to do. It requires enormous humility. And I'm not sure that we're actually able to do it in our natural state. As I've thought about life, I've thought to myself, the two great commandments are quite impossible, really. How on earth can any one of us love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, let alone do likewise with our neighbour? We're just not wired that way. We can only do it when we understand that, in fact, our pride's completely misplaced. We have nothing to boast on. We're as bad as the next person. We may not be as bad as the next person in absolute terms, but we've failed that test that was put before us in the two great commandments just as badly as everybody else. We don't love God, basically hate him. So we don't want him to run our lives until we understand what actually is being done for us. And that changes everything. So again, you can't just feel these things. You will feel them when you understand the full impact of the facts, the story set out. But to go back to Greg Sheridan, he points out, we now know that the New Testament's historicity, is that the right way? It's historically reliable. Those events happen. The culture was like that. Jesus existed. He was crucified. But that doesn't prove the miracles or the resurrection or eternal life, but you go a long way down of saying, well, actually, factually, it lines up. So let's have a careful, calm examination of his claims and decide whether they're true or not. It's not intellectual suicide to commit to faith in Christ. In fact, to me, it's more rational than not believing. And I say that very sincerely. I know others have drawn a different conclusion, but I would hope they've only drawn it after really thinking it through. Because the price for not thinking it through might be horribly high.
And John, for those listening with us, how might someone go about exploring those claims of the Bible? Because they're big claims and there's huge implications. How would they go about looking at the evidence? How would they go about weighing up, is this truth? Is this something I could believe in? What advice would you have for that person?
Look, I think the options are manifold, really. You can jump on the internet, you can Google these things and find the arguments for and against. You can read whether it's Who Moved the Stone or whether it's Greg Sheridan's terrific new book, which I seem to be giving quite a plug to, but he's a serious Australian intellectual saying these claims should be examined closely and mounting the case for them. Whether it's listening to the debates on YouTube now, I mean, it's a fantastic resource. It really is. And go and listen to some of the people who debated Christopher Hitchens, the great atheist. Then go and listen to his brother Peter.
Yes.
Who says, the subtitle of his book, Rage Against God, is How Atheism Converted Me to Christianity. He lived in Russia. He saw what happens when you strip the soul out of a people, the devastating results. And he turned back to faith, having been just as rebellious as his brother Christopher. But then, of course, there's always, going to a good church, and I don't say this like yours, where the Bible is taught, where it's brought to life. You can meet with others and hear of their experience, see their experience, feel their experience.
Mm.
And, we live in an age of huge loneliness. Now, loneliness is not just a feeling. I mean, it's a very real thing.
Mm.
And as C.S. Lewis said, if you're hungry, it implies there's food there. If there's loneliness there, it implies that there's a solution to loneliness.
Mm.
And the fellowship of joining together with other people of like belief is enormously, if you like, encouraging of those who are thinking about taking that step, and then of keeping them, if you like, encouraged in their journey going forward.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, it brings me back to my, how I found Jesus, opening up the Bible and looking at it and reading it and exploring it, and then doing that with others and asking big questions. And, I lament, people who've not taken that step, at least to explore it, at least to read the Bible and grapple with it. It was so, so formative, so significant. You mentioned earlier about Jordan Peterson, who I just think is quite a phenomenon, really. You've sat down with him, I think, a couple of times, had some cracker interviews with him, which are accessible all online. But you've also sat down with a whole host of people. Matthew McConaughey, I think that's how you say his surname, recently, the Hollywood actor, a whole host of fascinating people. Who, in all of these interviews, who's surprised you perhaps the most?
Probably Jordan Peterson, because we launched with Jordan Peterson, and I was wondering how it would go and whether I'd be able to do justice to his towering intellect and what have you. And we ended up in a fascinating discussion where it just happened. I'm not the historian he is, but our interests intersected, and we'd drawn many of the same lessons out of communist Russia in the 20s and 30s. Yeah. That was a great surprise and a great joy to me. But every one of them has been a surprise in a way. One of the things that's been really interesting, we talked about this earlier, how do you get on with people you disagree with, has been the extraordinary warmth and friendship. People say it's a conservative website. It's not. We talk to a great variety of people from around the world, and some are conservative, some are not. But the great warmth, when you've got to what Frank Ferruti said is the real distinction now, it's not between left and right. It's between people who are interested in evidence and facts and history and reality and, the defensible, versus simply feeling, I feel this way, therefore that's true for me, therefore it's true. Mm. That seems to me now, I may be putting words in his mouth, it's not my intention, but it's what I took out of our conversation when he said the old labels don't work anymore. That seems to me to be a useful thing to understand. And it's amazing how you can bridge the differences once you commit to talking about the issues rather than the feelings, which rapidly become, I will argue with you because I don't like you and I disagree with you, rather than I will discuss with you our perspectives and find common ground.
And was there any other people we should particularly look at that in terms of those interviews that you found were helpful?
I don't know where to start. One of the ones I enjoyed most was with Kim Beazley. Right. We were both Deputy Prime Ministers from different sides of the House, but he's a wonderful man, a wonderful Australian, incredibly insightful, and it's one that I would recommend to people. He certainly has an enormous respect for faith. I don't know his own personal perspective. That's not my business. But he was terrific. Peter Hitchens, curmudgeonly and difficult as I don't think he'd mind me saying that. I think he'd say it of himself as he can be. He's a wonderfully clear thinker, and underneath it all, actually a deeply caring man. He was terrific fun. I enjoyed him enormously. Melanie Phillips, a Jewish writer who wrote a book Guardian Angels, one of the best written short books I've ever read. It's her story.
Wow.
From my journey from leftism to sanity. And she used to work for the Guardian. She was left-wing, Labor Party background, et cetera, et cetera. And she said that she really parted because the left used to defend family vigorously, and then it started to turn on family as now the enemy of the family, in her view, in many ways. She was absolutely wonderful to talk to, but I shouldn't single them. It's easy to talk about friends like Peter Costello, John Howard. We don't, as a general rule, talk to serving politicians out of respect for them and their busyness. One exception was General Jim Molan, who's in the Senate, but we talked about defence. That was a very important interview for anybody worried about how we face up to the very real strategic challenges confronting us. So there are many. Abigail Shire, who wrote the book about gender dysphoria, the recent one, I think that's a very important one. Carl Trueman, a Christian theologian, talking about how we've become psychological people. Look, I could go on and on, but I've enjoyed that. All of them have been terrific. They've been very generous with their time. It's been great fun and a great experience for me. But the great and encouraging thing is we've been going a tad over 3 years. We've had 15 million people listen to tap into our conversations online. And we don't know how many podcasts, people listening in the car over and above that. They're not all Australian, because some of our guests are not Australians, but it's tremendously rewarding and such a privilege to have people come up and say, look, I listened to your conversation about X with somebody or other. We did a series on farming, for example, and people love them and they get a lot out of them. And that's credit to the guests, not to me.
Oh, it's a wonderful work, John, and appreciate your leadership in that space. And, for people who have not checked out the website, they should. There's some fantastic, long-form interviews, which I think we need in this moment, rather than sound bites and looking at politics from a distance. To be able to get into real stories about real issues, I think you do a fantastic a fantastic job in that space. I wanted to finish with a question about our country. It's a great country, Australia, and in an interview, you talked about it really being at a crossroads where there are opportunities for our country, but there are also threats. I'd love to hear John Anderson's take on what do you see right now are the big challenges, the big threats, and where are the opportunities? And maybe if I could push it a bit further, as Christians, listening on, in homes across Australia, how might they respond to these threats and these opportunities?
Well, it's a good question. I think culturally our biggest threat is that we actually loathe our own past now. Every time we turn around, there's somebody else telling us that we are victim makers, we're oppressors, we're the sons and daughters of terrible colonists and imperialists who did frightful things. And that's a Western-wide thing. America tearing itself over its past, destaturing movements and so on and so forth, all in the name of, I suppose you'd say, in the view of those perpetrating a lot of these things, of progress. And yet in reality, it seems to me that, again, one of my guests, Frank Ferruti, he wrote recently that if a lot of it's about creating an impression in the minds of young people that the culture that they've inherited is illegitimate and not worth fighting for. Well, freedom is worth fighting for. And our liberal democratic capitalist sort of background, free enterprise background, may not have been perfect, but I'd make 2 points. It's delivered us living standards and the capacity to do things for people and to lift people out of poverty, to extend their life standards, length of life and what have you, educational opportunities here and around the world, more than any other system ever known, ever devised. It's as simple as that. That's a historical and rational reality. So we ought to be careful about dismantling it. But that's our greatest challenge of all, I think. And it cripples us when it comes to preparing for the next economic shock. There will be one. We had the great financial crisis. Countries went deeply into debt as a result of that, deeply into debt. And that's tough on young people because they inherit the debt and the taxes to pay it off. Now we have COVID and we've multiplied those debts. We've made it worse. And again, it'll be tough for our young people. We need strong policies to cope with those. We need strong policies to make sure that mid-sized nations like Australia can remain independent and free in the new authoritarian threats that are emerging around the world. They are very real. They're very real. What can we do? Well, never lose hope. We must have hope. And our hope is an eternal hope. It's the recognition that this is a broken and fallen world and we should not love it overly. We should love the God who loves us and place our trust in him. And that should, I think, bring us to the point of understanding the urgency, even when it's resisted, of loving others into the kingdom. And I use those words because we shouldn't try and berate them or ear bash them or Bible thump them, but we ought to show them a better way. We ought to be people who really, it has to be said of, are loving and kind and considerate and other person-centered. And that's not easy.
It's not easy, but it is our way, and it is a great word, John. I'd love to pray for you and for our listeners just to conclude our time together. Would that be okay?
Of course.
Father, I thank you so much for this time that we've had together. I thank you for John and your great love at work in his life. I thank you for the many gifts you've given him, the opportunities he's had to make known the goodness of the gospel, to serve you in a very significant way here in Australia. And I do thank you for his word and encouragement for us all to take hold of the hope that we have in Jesus. It's a living hope. It's a certain hope. It's a hope that we can know right now. We ask for that hope, Lord, in a world where at times things can be difficult. This world is broken, and yet we thank you, Lord, that in Jesus you are making all things new. And we also ask, Lord, that you would help us to be a loving people. Thank you for that great call to love you with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and that call to love our neighbour as we love ourselves. We confess, Lord, that that's not always easy. That is hard. It can be difficult. And we ask, Lord, that your Spirit would guide us in that we would be known as a people of love. I thank you for this time that we've had, and I pray that you'd get the glory. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, John, for your time.
Hope that was some use.